Good evening. On here? Can you hear me? Good evening. How is everybody this evening? Wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming out. It's great to see a fantastic turnout for our forum this evening. I'm David Horton. I'm going to serve as your moderator. I'll be bringing out our candidates and introducing them here in just a minute. But before we get started, we just wanted to make a couple of statements and sort of get everything out there. We appreciate that everybody's here. We're all neighbors in this valley. We want to treat each other as such. So we've got a few little ground rules we want to keep in mind. I will give you an opportunity to cheer for your candidates, but I'll ask that you hold your applause at other times, okay? Okay. We don't want any booing, heckling, hissing, anything like that if you hear something you don't like. So, yeah, boo on that, but we don't want to have that. So we'll ask that everybody treat each other with a lot of respect this evening and be really positive. Passion is a great thing. It gets a lot of folks to turn out for elections, gets a lot of people excited, but unchecked, it can become kind of a negative. And we don't want that. We want this to be a very positive forum as we talk about what the candidates are going to do. This is a job interview for some very important jobs. House of Delegates first, and then the Sheriff's job is our second forum section this evening. And we want to see what these folks are going to do. So we're going to ask them questions about the issues, and they're going to have the opportunity to respond to those. And I'll give you a full rundown of that. We do want to thank a couple of people tonight. Please welcome and thank the Southwest Times for putting this together. I think they did a great job. We want to thank the Pulaski Theater for hosting us in their beautiful venue. Come see the show here. We also want to thank the Fine Arts Center for the New River Valley. We appreciate them. Let's hear it for the Fine Arts Center. And we want to thank Pulaski County. They provided our flags and helped us with everything, so thank you, Pulaski County. Okay, I'm going to move over to my seat and start to bring you your candidates, and we'll get this show on the road. Our goal is to keep each section to about an hour and a little bit of change. So our first section will be with our House of Delegates candidates, and we are going to go through the questioning with them, and then we're going to have a brief intermission as we change out and bring up our sheriff's candidates. I do want to ask that everyone please silence your cell phone. We don't want to have any cell phones going off during the program, and better yet, just put your phone away. That'll make it much better. And now we have your candidates for the House of Delegates District 7. First, we'd like to introduce Mr. Nick Rush. Mr. Rush graduated from Christiansburg High School and served the United States Army as a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. He served as a delegate since January 2012. Outside his work with the General Assembly, he is an investment advisor. We would also like to introduce the challenger for the District 7 seat, Ms. Flo Kettner. Ms. Kettner is a stay-at-home mother of 3 young children. She and her family have lived in the New River Valley for over 25 years. She is a graduate of both Floyd County High School and Radford University. Ms. Flo Kettner. And now our candidates for the House of Delegates District 12, Mr. Joseph Yost. Mr. Yost is an alumnus of Giles County Public Schools and a graduate of Radford University, earning both a Bachelor's of Science and a Master of Arts in Criminal Justice in just 4 years. He served as delegate since January 2012. Outside his work with the General Assembly, Mr. Yost is the Executive Director of the Giles County Historical Society. Mr. Yost. And the challenger for the District 12 House of Delegates seat, Mr. Chris Hurst. Mr. Hurst is an alumnus of Emerson University, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in broadcast journalism. Following graduation, he pursued a career as a television news reporter and anchor, most recently with WDBJ-7 in Roanoke, where he served from August of 2010 until earlier this year. Mr. Chris Hurst. I must say, you as an audience did a fine job in welcoming your candidates. Now, at this point, we will ask that you hold your applause until I ask you once again to applaud for the candidates at the end of the forum. And the way we're going to do this, each candidate is going to get the same question. We're going to go down the line. We're going to begin just to my immediate right and ask each question as we go, and we'll rotate who gets the question first. So Mr. Hurst will get to answer the first question first, and then Mr. Yost and Ms. Kettner, and then finally Mr. Rush. We're going to touch on several different areas. Some areas have multiple questions. Some areas just have one. I will repeat the question twice for the candidates the first time, and then ask each individual candidate after that the question once again. They have 2 minutes to answer. Carol is our timekeeper. Can you please give a round of applause for Carol? She's She will notify the candidates when they have 1 minute remaining, 30 seconds, and then when time's up, I will probably have to be the interrupting moderator to keep us moving forward. Are we ready to begin? Okay. Mr. Hurst, the first question is yours to answer first, and then we'll go down the line, and this is in the area of education. According to the Virginia Department of Education, the average teacher salary in Virginia for fiscal year 2015 was $54,000. For the same period, teachers in Pulaski County averaged $44,800, teachers in the city of Radford averaged $50,200, teachers in Giles averaged $41,000, teachers in Montgomery County averaged $49,000, teachers in Floyd averaged $45,300, and in Arlington they averaged $75,000. The disparity doesn't end there in education. In 2009, during the recession, the state adjusted the formulas used to determine how much money school districts receive, but the state's economy bounced back without changing that formula. Researchers at the Commonwealth Institute say that Virginia schools are being shortchanged $800 million a year because of the formulas that underestimate what it costs to educate our children. Is this disparity in education funding an indication that Richmond doesn't get it for Southwest Virginia? If so, what can be done to change this, and why does Southwest Virginia lag behind? Once again, is this because Richmond doesn't get it for Southwest Virginia? If so, what can be done to change this, and why does Southwest Virginia lag behind? Please begin.
Well, I think that it's an issue that doesn't just extend with Southwest Virginia, but to a lot of rural communities across central Virginia, South Side, and in localities where we're seeing dwindling tax bases and we're seeing lower average median incomes. Now, certainly what happened during the recession was that there were drastic cuts to education, and we haven't seen that be restored. And in Pulaski County, that's 11.5% of what the state used to give out to Pulaski County to educate its students, from where we were in 2008, 2009 to where we are currently. And so that certainly needs to change, and we need to restore that funding. And so I do think we need to look at making sure that we fully fund our SOQ positions, because if the state were to actually take on its role more in wanting to educate our students and appropriating more to make sure that we actually fully fund our SOQ, I think that that would allow localities to free up to be able to increase teacher pay at a rate that they think would be acceptable to them. One thing, though, that I think is important to note is when you talk about Richmond not getting it or doesn't seem to really want to do the job, is this 2% pay raise that occurred in the past General Assembly year that General Assembly members patted themselves on the back for, but again, that was only for SOQ funded positions, standards of quality positions. But right now it's the standards of inequality, folks, because Pulaski County pays 41% more from what the SOQ says is the cost to educate children in the county. And so when that happened, the 2% pay raise was only for those SOQ funded positions. And so Dr. Sears and others had to decide, the school board, are we going to say that this second grade teacher is an SOQ position and this other second grade teacher is not? And so we put another unfunded mandate onto our local school divisions to have to make sure that they made sure that all teachers got that 2% pay raise. We need to make sure that Richmond does its job in making sure that there's more direct student aid per pupil all across the Commonwealth, but especially here in Southwest Virginia.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, same question. Is this disparity in education funding and education that Richmond doesn't get it? If so, what can be done to change this, and why does Southwest Virginia lag behind in this area? Please begin.
Well, and I think when you look at where we're at, there were some very significant cuts that were made following the 2008-2009 recession. Many of those were to education, also to other services in the Commonwealth. Since we've been in office in 2012, we've slowly been making progress in adding and restoring those money back. This past session, we made one of the single biggest investments in public K-12 education in the history of the Commonwealth, which I think is very indicative of the way things work in Richmond. When you have a Republican-controlled legislature, a Democrat, and the governor's mansion, we were still able to work together and come together on this very important topic. And one that I'm very familiar with and have pushed hard for the last 6 years since I've been in office, and been lucky enough to be endorsed by the Virginia Education Association over the last 3 re-election cycles. And when you look at the numbers, when you talk about the funding formula for funding education, the formula is based on the locality's ability to pay. So Northern Virginia obviously is going to have a much higher ability to pay for itself than localities in Southwest Virginia. When you look at per pupil spending overall, districts and their divisions in the areas of the 12th district get on average 73% more money than areas in Northern Virginia. And this is the result of because we don't have necessarily that ability to pay, and this is something we pushed hard for. Both Delegate Rush and I have introduced budget amendments to increase teacher pay and other education initiatives over the last 6 years. And I think this is one it's important to everybody. Our public schools are so important to us, both here in Pulaski County and across the Narrow Valley. In rural areas, they're more than a public school. They're a community center. It's where people gather for events and sporting events and receive an education. And it's been one of my top priorities to fight for that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, the same question. Is this disparity in education funding and indication that Richmond doesn't get it? If so, what can be done to change it, and why does Southwest Virginia lag behind in this area?
I think one of the issues that a lot of people are concerned with is that we are being ignored for Northern Virginia. And when you go up to the schools in Northern Virginia, you see beautiful schools that are well built, well made, and you're seeing teachers that seem to have salaries that suit them, but a lot of that has to do with the localities having more money. And one of the things we have to be paying attention to is the funding that the general area is getting in order to put it towards the schools and towards the teachers. But on top of that, we are forcing our teachers to spend the money that they have on so many of the supplies that the schools have. And so even if we give them a higher rate of pay, they're still having to put more of their money out into the school system for their own students, for their own products, for their own classrooms. And some of the best areas we can look at is if we're funding the schools, we're helping them so they can then allocate more of the money towards their teachers. We need to make sure that they can have buildings that are safe and comfortable learning environments and teaching environments for everyone. And then the schools can focus more, and we're going to bring in more students by having better buildings, better atmospheres, better supplies within the school, better electronics. And parents shop for schools. When they want to find a place to live, they shop for schools. And if we raise the schools that we have in this area, you're going to find an influx of people, and the more revenue you have in the area, because you have more people working jobs, you're going to find the schools have better funding, just like they do when you go up to Northern Virginia, where you have a lot of people in a small area.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, is this disparity in education funding an indication that Richmond doesn't get it? If so, what can be done to change this? And why does Southwest Virginia lag behind in this area?
Well, as a son of a public school teacher and a product of Montgomery County Public Schools, I understand how important our public schools are. And that's why this year I'm on appropriations. I was lucky enough to be I'm the only Southwest Virginia member on appropriations. It's a budget writing committee, and this year I authored the 10-10-10 plan. And what that did was focus money to school divisions that were smaller, that had lost, had a declining enrollment and over the last 10 years. And we all know Pulaski County was hit hard by NAFTA. I used to be a FedEx driver up here. I tell this story all the time. I used to deliver to the 5th floor of Pulaski Furniture every day. And that was one of 3 or 4 factories they had here in the county. They're not here anymore. So we understand what's happened, and through my role on appropriations with this 10-10-10 plan, we were able to get more money to Pulaski County. It was around $200,000, which was much needed. You know, and Joseph and I are proud of being able to provide teacher pay raises 5 out of the 6 years. We've invested in public education in the Commonwealth, especially in Southwest Virginia. Another thing that we worked on very hard and should be coming up is to allow local school divisions to pull themselves together to bring down health insurance prices for our public employees. We worked hard on that. It took us about, I think, 4 years to get that done. I just had a report. I was in Richmond on Monday for appropriations. I just had a report on that. That's coming around. It looks like we may have over 100,000 state local government employees in this pool. We hope that that's going to drive down costs and allow our teachers to have more take-home pay.
Thank you very much. Great job on the first question, everybody. We're through that. We're going to start with our second question. Mr. Yost, this will be your question to answer first. School construction and renovation has been a major issue in the districts represented here this evening. Montgomery County has built several new schools over the past few years, yet there are still complaints that some communities, such as Christiansburg, have been left out of the mix and are overdue. As most of you may know, Pulaski County will vote on November 7th whether or not to approve a $47 million bond referendum package to finance the construction of a new consolidated middle school to replace the middle schools in Pulaski and Dublin. First, have you recently toured the existing schools? And second, are you in favor of building new schools in these communities, or do you think other options should be considered? So first, have you visited the schools? Second, do you think that we should build new schools in the communities, or should other options be considered? Please begin.
No, I haven't visited Pulaski Middle School specifically, but have seen plenty of pictures posted around of some of the reasons that it would be in need of renovation or to build a new school. I think a lot of those decisions are best made at the local level. You know, I'm originally from Giles. That's where I was born and raised. Went to Giles High School and Mason McClarty. These are the same schools that my parents went to when I was a kid. And so, you know, if schools are maintained properly over the years and have that ability, then sometimes renovation is just easier and cheaper for that community. But you do get into situations where you are going to need to build that new building for various reasons, whether like in Blacksburg, when the high school gym fell several years ago, or in the case of Pulaski Middle School, where sometimes it's going to be cheaper to actually build a new facility than to actually renovate the building. So I think a lot of these decisions are left up to the community. One of the things that I tried to help Pulaski with several years ago was the idea of a cigarette tax that would be for Pulaski County. Right now there's only 2 counties in the Commonwealth that collect cigarette taxes. This would have been a little bit different and would allow the collection of the cigarette tax by a county, by Pulaski County, but all the money collected would have went towards capital improvements and capital constructions for the school system to help alleviate some of these issues.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, have you toured the existing schools? And second, are you in favor of building new schools in these communities, or do you think other options should be considered? Please begin.
Yes, I have toured some of the schools. Specifically, the one that comes to mind is Dublin Middle, and I am aware that Pulaski is in worse condition. However, I believe that what I witnessed, seeing the mold on the walls that they had attempted to paint over, and it's already coming back through, seeing water that was draining around an outlet in the art department. And it was brought to my attention today that a snake fell through the ceiling and landed on a poor student's head. And they're currently trying to eradicate as many as they can from the school if there are more. And those concerns are extremely important because, again, we're talking safety. There's girders holding the walls up, and these are things that we have to take very, very seriously. We're not just talking about whether it's a productive environment to learn. We're talking about the safety of hundreds of children and faculty members of all sorts. And we're not talking about just during the school day when you have an assembly just like we're having this evening. And that funding is extremely important. Now, whether or not that's something that the state can take care of is something that we would have to decide when we get there and how we could allocate it. But I do believe that it is important to consider, and sometimes you are beyond the ability to repair, especially after you exceed a certain age. It's similar to a car. It can be an antique, but that doesn't mean you can drive it everywhere. If a building gets old, sometimes you have to replace it. And you do have the luxury of looking at the funding you will gain from selling the old property when you are able to build a new school and empty it out.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, have you toured the existing schools, and do you think you're in favor of building new schools in these communities, or should other options be considered?
Yes, I have. I have toured, I don't know about every school in Pulaski County. I don't think I've been to the new one in Fairlawn, but I've been to just about all the other ones. Some, Pulaski Middle School is actually a school that I've toured quite a bit. I'm going to tell you a quick story. I'm from Southwest Virginia, so I do that a lot. But somehow I got to be friends with the lunch lady. So every Thanksgiving, she invites me up there to have Thanksgiving dinner with, or Thanksgiving lunch with the students. I really enjoy that. I also get to go around the school. But having said that, since I was on the Montgomery County Board of Supervisors for 12 years, we built 7 schools in Montgomery County. Building school, having appropriate school buildings is very, very important. It's very important for economic development. It makes Joseph and my job easier to sell Pulaski County if the school system is up and running in an appropriate way. The original question mentioned the Christiansburg Strand, that they haven't had a school built. They haven't had a school built since I left the Board of Supervisors. I don't know if that kind of says how effective I was when I was on the Board of Supervisors or not. Well, I'll let the voters decide that. But there hasn't been one built in Christiansburg since then. I'm also advocating for Christiansburg to get the schools built that they need and deserve. You know, that's why I go back to the 10-10-10 plan, and I'm going to talk about that because that is where the state can come in and help counties in these positions and help. That $200,000 is going to help Pulaski County this year. And if I'm returned and the Speaker puts me back on appropriations, I'm going to continue to look at innovative ways that we can have our county governments run efficiently and that the state can help.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hurst, same question. Have you toured the existing schools? And second, are you in favor of building new schools in these communities, or should other options be considered?
I've not toured the schools recently as part of my campaign for delegate, but certainly something that we've covered extensively during my time at WDBJ7. You know, I think that this is really shocking for a lot of people to see when the gym at Pulaski County Middle School is held up with steel girders, when we see that we have continuous mold problems that are there at the middle school, when we are dealing with systemic issues of flat roofs for these schools no longer being code compliant, so now they need to have a slope to them. And no child should be going to school where there's no heat and no air conditioning so that they have to close school when it gets to be too warm or too cold. Now, I think it's all wonderful that a lot of us have gone to schools that our parents went to. But we need to make sure that we're providing the best possible education environment for our students, no matter where they live all across the Commonwealth. And I think that this issue really still goes back to passing the buck. From the men and women in Richmond not being big boys and big girls and raiding the literary fund that used to be a fund where you could actually take out loans to build new capital improvement projects, but now that's been used as a stopgap to help with lowering general fund appropriations for our school divisions. And that means that all of the renovations that could have happened here in Pulaski County, for Pulaski County Middle and for Dublin Middle, have gone unfettered and unchecked, really because we have just passed the buck on to our school boards and to our boards of supervisors. Look, nobody wants to raise taxes. Nobody wants to make you have to pay more, but we don't give our localities enough ability to levy different revenue raising options. And so that's a big issue for me, is trying to empower localities to figure out solutions for themselves besides just a personal property tax increase or a real estate tax increase. And so we also need to understand too that as much as I love the idea of wanting to have counties be able to collect the cigarette taxes, the tobacco lobby will never let it happen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to move on from education to healthcare, and as a part of that, women's health issues as well. And this is just random how this worked out, but Ms. Kettner, you have the opportunity to answer this question first. In 2017, the General Assembly looked at several different measures concerning women's health issues in particular. One bill passed by both houses and waiting on the governor's signature would require insurance companies to provide women with a 12-month supply of contraceptives. House Bill 2186, which failed to get a hearing in the Committee for Courts on Justice, would have eliminated all the procedures and processes, including the performance of an ultrasound required to receive an abortion. Separate versions of bills proposed in both the Senate and House, which have allowed women to waive a time period before an abortion could be performed. Both versions have failed. What is your stance on women's health issues and reproductive rights? Ms. Kettner, what is your stance on women's health issues and reproductive rights?
First of all, when it comes to a lot of the facilities that supply our female reproductive health care, I think that it is important to have them. We need facilities that people feel comfortable going into. They feel they are getting private care. We need to make sure we keep it available, that they can protect their lives from cancer screenings and things where they're worried about having these issues and they don't have the funding, the money at home to go to a larger doctor. So having the ability to have preventative care is extremely important. When it comes to contraception, I think it is still very important to have it available. A large debate right now is the right to access and perform abortions. And if we want to steer away from allowing that, I believe that we need to make sure we make contraception available, and I think it should be available at minimal to no cost, especially to young girls, where we're most concerned. And I believe we need to make family planning an option. As far as abortion bills and having ultrasounds and waiving time periods, I think that is something that is best suited to their physician, especially when you're talking about a lot of women who normally face this are facing physical issues. I know of a young girl I grew up with who has a damaged heart. She has a hole in her heart, and if she found herself pregnant in less than 3 months, it would kill her. So I think that's something that between her and her doctor would be extremely imperative for them to discuss, more than my decision.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, where do you stand on women's health issues and reproductive rights?
Well, I've supported the bill that you mentioned earlier for insurance companies to offer contraceptives for a 12-month period. I supported that. Was happy to do so. I consider myself a pro-life candidate. My wife and I, my wife Jennifer is here tonight, and we support financially the Pregnancy Resource Center. We do that. We do a monthly donation. Those folks offer women alternatives to abortion, and we proudly do that. And, so I consider myself pro-life.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hurst, what is your stance on women's health issues and reproductive rights?
Well, one of the, I have no problem saying this, that I do believe that a woman's health care decision should be left between her and her doctor. We need to get politicians out of doctors' offices when we're making choices for women. And we also need to understand that contraception coverage is not something that is just to allow women to prevent unintended pregnancies. That a lot of women use what we consider to be birth control to also manage cysts. They use it to treat chronic acne. They use what we consider to be birth control to also help treat chronic menstrual pain. So these are other medical conditions besides just using it for straight up quote-unquote birth control that I think do need to be protected in the state of Virginia, so that women can have access to those kinds of medical treatments if a doctor thinks that should be happening. But you know, the debate would not be occurring right now, folks, if we were talking about Viagra or Cialis, to be frank with you. It's only because we are continuing to have these attacks on women where we are addressing some fundamental issues here in this Commonwealth. I was talking to a doctor, a gynecologist, who says that she moved here from out of state and has not seen so many advanced cases of cervical cancer, stage 3 and beyond, than here in Southwest Virginia. It's because we have a lack of access for women's health resource providers. And so we need to make sure that women always will be able to see a doctor, and if that includes wanting to have abortion services provided, I think we need to make sure that there is a safe, legal way to do it, because no matter if it's legal or illegal, it's still going to happen, and we need to make sure that women's rights are protected.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, what's your stance on women's health issue and reproductive rights?
Well, I too was supportive of the bill that we had this past year to provide 12-month coverage for birth control. You know, this is one of those issues that I've learned over the last 6 years. There's a lot of passion behind it. It's not a black and white issue, as a lot of people think it is. There's a lot of nuances to it. It's very complicated. You know, my wife and I were blessed 16 months ago, a little over 16 months ago now, with our first baby girl after losing 2 before that. And this is something that for us is very personal and private. And one of the things that I hear a lot that I sort of shake my head about, we talk about taking the politics out between the patient and their doctor, but there's all kinds of stuff that we do in the General Assembly outside of women's health care and other health care issues, where we have mandated, for example, several years ago, and I thought it was the right thing to do, that when a woman has a mammogram, if it is determined that she has dense breast tissue, she has to be informed of that so that she knows that the results of that mammogram may not be accurate. Several years ago, we had a bill about Lyme's disease that mandated that patients are told that the test may not be accurate if they're testing for Lyme's disease. So I think there are certain things that we have to do as a body, as a legislature, to ensure, whether it's on women's health issues or other health care issues, to ensure that there is a healthy and a safe procedure being done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, staying with the area of health care, access to health care and insurance remains an issue for many Virginians. What can the General Assembly do to help address this issue for Southwest Virginia specifically? So access to health care remains an issue for many Virginians. What can the General Assembly help do to address that for Southwest Virginia?
I think what we can do is we can talk about what we've done. This last, in 2016, and the program started this year, it's called the Governor's Access Program. That's for, it's a skinny Medicaid plan for folks with mental illness. We also got ARTS, which is an addiction recovery treatment program that we just started. They started, I think, a couple months ago, 2017. We've had folks sign up for those. Those are more cost-effective ways to deal with these problems, and we're seeing that here in Pulaski County in the New River Valley with drug problems. We've also, there's a lot of talk about Medicaid expansion. Medicaid has expanded. It's expanded from 5% to 23% of our budget. But we haven't expanded eligibility to that. So if I'm reelected, I think we have an administration in Washington now that's not trying to protect its legacy through the ACA. So Virginia can actually ask for waivers so we can offer plans that are more affordable, maybe a skinny plan. You don't need all the coverages that are mandated under the ACA. Allow larger pools, like what Joseph and I did with the public employees of local governments. Allow associations to get together and have larger pools to spread that risk around. So we've got an administration that may be open to doing some of those things with an exemption from the ACA, and I look forward to working to improve those healthcare outcomes and access.
Thank you very much. I am going to pause for just a second. I've heard a few cell phones going off. Please silence your cell phone, and better yet, just put it away. But we don't want to have those going off during the program. Mr. Hurst, the same question to you. Access to health care and insurance remains an issue for many Virginians. What can the General Assembly do to address this issue for Southwest Virginia?
I am a strong supporter of Medicaid expansion in Virginia. In the 12th district, that would be 4,000 people who would have access to health insurance coverage, often for the first time. Virginia has one of the most onerous qualification standards in order to qualify for Medicaid here across the country. You need to be making around 30% of the federal poverty level in order to qualify for Medicaid in Virginia. So that means that a couple with a child has to make under $10,000 in order to qualify. And we need to make sure that we expand Medicaid here in the Commonwealth, because that would just raise it to 100% of the federal poverty level, which says that everybody who lives in poverty should be able to have access to health insurance. I think that that's a value that we can all agree on. Has Medicaid spending increased? Yes. Has overall health care spending increased? Oh yeah, I bet. I mean, how many of your premiums and deductibles and copays have gone up? No matter whether it's been the Affordable Care Act's fault or whether it's been because of Medicaid's ballooning budget, the fact is that per enrollee, Medicaid spending has actually remained fairly constant. What I am the most focused in is actually not just looking at who's eventually paying the bill, whether it's insurance companies, Medicaid, the government, or you, it's the actual cost of care itself. And everybody looks at their benefits, their explanation of benefits from insurance companies, and looks at their hospital bills and thinks, why is it $77 for gauze pads? Why is it going to be $14 for 2 Tylenol that I had in my purse but I wasn't allowed to use because the hospital told me I couldn't? Who are all these doctors? Are they in my network or out of my network that are coming in to see me when I'm sick and in the hospital? And so I think it's getting tough with the actual providers of care, pharmaceutical companies, as well as insurance companies and hospital providers, to make sure we lower the overall cost of care too. Now that is something that states can take an active role in. Now when we talk about trying to have different waivers that the federal government may allow us to do, allowing people to go into skinny plans where we don't necessarily have essential health benefits anymore, that's going to put a lot of older folks into high-risk pools, and those premiums will skyrocket.
There. Sorry, your time has expired on that one. Mr. Yost, the same question. Access to health care and insurance remains an issue for many. How can the General Assembly address this for Southwest Virginia?
I think Delegate Rush is absolutely right. One of the things that we've done over the last several years, including the Governor's Access Program, and also putting hundreds of millions of dollars towards our free clinics and our community health care centers here, not only in Southwest Virginia, but across Virginia. I think when we talk about Medicaid expansion, we do have to approach it carefully. If you look at the experience of what other states have went through who have chosen to expand Medicaid, whether it be Kentucky, Oregon's trying to fill a $1.2 billion budget shortfall right now because they chose to expand Medicaid. Massachusetts is in the process of wanting to roll Medicaid expansion back because it has come too expensive for them. The federal government's not paying them 100% anymore, and so they can't afford it, and they're trying to move back to the way they were pre-Medicaid expansion. Virginia's Medicaid program without expansion has went from 5% to almost 25% of the state budget. Our revenues grow at 8% of the year. Our revenues grow at 4% a year, and Medicaid grows at 8% a year. That is not sustainable, and when you're constitutionally mandated to have a balanced budget, sometimes you just have to think not only for the next year or the year after that, but you have to think 5 years from now, 10 from now, where are you going to be? If we expand and we have the same experience in other states, Kentucky, for example, their Medicaid program was budgeted $30-some million a year for the first year with $70-some million. That's when we have to come back the following year, or even come back in a special session, and you have to make painful cuts to things like K-12 education, higher education, things that we all support and don't want to cut: mental health services, public safety, transportation. And so I think, the way we've headed in the General Assembly so far, with currently investing in what services that we have, and then also investing in additional mental health services, additional substance abuse services, I think that's been the way to go.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, access remains an issue for many Virginians. What can the General Assembly do to help address this issue for Southwest Virginia?
Well, I will come out on the record that I do support Medicare and Medicaid expansion. I have recently signed on with a collective of candidates that are examining and exploring an option for a single health care option here in Virginia specifically. Something that concerns me is we recently opened up the borders for healthcare, and I think that what we're going to find is many of our healthcare providers or the insurance providers are going to move to the state with the least amount of regulations so that they can raise prices and lower what they're doing. On that, I support some of the options we do have here, like expanding the waiver for our program and making it easier for those who have mental disabilities to live as close to a normal life as possible by being in a homestay with a caring family versus being in a facility that costs the state tons more money. I believe in having protections for those with a pre-existing condition. I myself have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed in 2006. I'm obviously living a pretty normal life, but I do have to take a medication once a month that costs me $27,000 a month after my insurance picks up, which thankfully my insurance is wonderful and it's able to pick up more than that because I passed what's called a donut hole, and it stops charging me at that point. But there's no reason why my medication should cost that much. It's a single dose at a time. But some of the things that really concern me is we need to be healthy enough as a society to be able to continue and vote and run for office and be everywhere else in our community that we want to be. And you're finding that there are some people who don't have that option, and their companies are not making it easier. There's a 8-month-old baby boy at St. Jude's right now who was diagnosed with a rare form of aggressive cancer, and though St. Jude's is taking care of him, the insurance company is not.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to move on now to talk a little bit about property rights. As the Southwest Times was preparing for the forum this evening, they received a number of comments about property rights. That was a pretty hot issue. One of the cases was about utilities on property, the others being about pipelines, things like that. In many cases, these residents feel like they're in a David versus Goliath situation where they're at a disadvantage due to large legal teams of those entities. Mr. Hurst, you have the opportunity to answer this question first. As candidate for delegate, how do you see the view of the rights of these property owners versus the concerns of the companies that deal with their property? What can be done at the state level to address these concerns? So how do you see the rights of the property owners versus the organizations that are looking at their property, and what can be done at the state level to address these concerns?
Well, I mean, the question is fundamentally easy to answer because your property right should only be infringed upon if it's for public use, right? And so corporations generally are not in the business of trying to market themselves to have projects that are going to be for public use. It's going to be for their own profit and their own corporate gain. And we saw this with the Mountain Valley Pipeline. That's why I've been staunchly against it and was dismayed to see that FERC approved the certificate of need, but still think that there's more work that can be done at the state level. And also, of course, we have an incredible network of local activists who have been fighting this pipeline, because we have to look at when should the government be taking your land, and it should only be for public use, not public need, not public benefit, not for future public possible jobs coming in, only for public use. They can take an easement or a right-of-way to extend out a road. They can take some land if they're going to build a park that your kids can use. But when you're talking about property rights and corporations, I really think that there's no place for your infringement of property rights to benefit some other corporation for which you will not get any kind of dividend or any kind of real value on the property for whatever kind of easement you do sign on to. I think we need to realize that the most important entity in Virginia is not the governor, it's not the Speaker of the House, it's Dominion and AEP and our utilities that are monopolies that should be regulated in a more strict and stringent fashion. We need to make sure that landowners are at the table and not on the menu, and that you're not put over the barrel when these eminent domain issues come up. And I think they're going to be coming up time and time again, more and more often, as I think the floodgates have started to open because Virginia is starting to roll back its protections for landowners and allow more corporate interests to come in and infringe upon your property rights.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, as a candidate for delegate, how do you view the rights of property owners versus concerns of the companies that deal with that property, and what can be done at the state level to address this issue?
Well, I think property rights are one of the most sacred rights that we hold in this country. I think that's one of the reasons that we made the break originally in '76. In 2012, our first year in office for both Nick and I, there was a constitutional amendment that was before us that put property right protections fully into the state constitution. We both were supporters of that. Eventually passed out in the General Assembly that year and was voted on by the voters in 2012, and overwhelmingly passed in the Commonwealth. When you talk about the pipeline issues, there are some significant concerns with property rights. There's a law in the books right now that I think is unconstitutional, have put in bills to try to repeal that specific section that gives these utilities the right to come on your property and survey your land even if you don't want them to. And we're currently working on draft legislation for the 2018 session that sort of takes a lot of the concerns that have been pulled together over the last 2 years since the fight started with the pipeline and try to put some more stringent protections for property owners if this is going to happen. I was certainly very disappointed to see that FERC provided the conditional approval for the certificate for the Mountain Valley Pipeline. This is something that I've worked hard on since 2015 and have worked to understand the issue and have some significant concerns about it, property rights being the most top.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, as a candidate for delegate, how do you view the rights of property owners versus concerns of the companies that deal with their property, and what can be done at the state level to address those concerns?
Well, I believe that, as have been stated so far, that property belongs to the person and it is their right. They've taken the time or they have inherited property from many generations, and we're not simply talking about losing a section of our yard for the sake of a sidewalk. We're talking about, in particular, the pipeline, a football-wide swath straight through the state and through our mountains. We're talking through national forests, but specifically we're talking about cutting up farms and hunting lands. And I mean, some people here specifically have lots of property, and they're cutting it right in half, and they're not even going to be compensating them appropriately. We're talking about clearing trees, and this is going to invite invasive species of plants to come through and take over the area, which will kill off more of the forest around it. I know of one area where it's coming up right beside a graveyard, and they're going to be clearing all the way up to the fence for this graveyard, and that's too much plausible plan for damage to something we hold sacred. And I actually recently visited a farm in Franklin County where they were going through and they were actually having to scan and sift through soil along the route to check for artifacts. And they were deciding whether an artifact was strong enough. So they're actually finding artifacts, but they're questioning, is it something important enough for a larger dig or to continue? And our properties, our land here, I mean, from the time of the wars, we have so much in this area. I don't like the idea of a private company coming through and taking it for their gain, especially in the case of the pipeline, where it's not from the United States. And the United States, state of Virginia. Sorry.
Thank you. Mr. Rush, as a candidate for delegate, how do you view the rights of property owners versus the concerns of the companies that deal with their property, and what can be done at the state level to address those concerns?
Well, I think individual rights, including property rights, are the most important rights we have in a constitutional republic. And I'm fully supportive of property rights. Joseph My good friend Joseph Yost just mentioned that in 2012, we supported a constitutional amendment that enshrined those rights in the Virginia Constitution. That was a reaction to a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said that public use could be for anything, whether it be providing one extra job or another penny to the local government, that could be considered public use. I disagree with that, and guess what? Joseph Yost disagreed with it, and you guys disagreed with it, because that constitutional amendment overwhelmingly passed. I've been supportive of Delegate Yost's attempts at legislation to correct what we see, this injustice that we see with utility companies coming on private property without landowners' permission. Unfortunately, we haven't been successful in that. But I guarantee you, if we go back, that we will continue to fight for that.
Thank you very much. That concludes our discussion of property rights for this moment. We would like to talk a little bit about safety, and there's a couple areas that we'd like to discuss with that. Mr. Yost, you have the opportunity to answer this question first. Discussions about making it more difficult to obtain a gun under Virginia laws have been a key issue in this campaign. Where do you fall on the spectrum of gun laws? Should gun restrictions be lessened or removed? Should guns be banned altogether, or are tougher restrictions needed when it comes to mental health and criminal background checks? Do you think that tougher enforcement of existing Virginia laws concerning firearms and harsher punishments for those who commit gun crimes are the best solution? Let me repeat that for you. Where do you fall on the spectrum of gun laws? Should gun restrictions be lessened or removed? Should guns be banned altogether, or tougher restrictions needed when it comes to mental health and criminal background checks? Do you think that tougher enforcement of existing Virginia laws concerning firearms and harsher punishments for those who commit gun crimes is the best solution?
Well, I've always been very supportive of Second Amendment rights. I've been endorsed by the NRA in all my elections, re-elections, and first election for office. I think when you look at the gun laws that we have on the books in the Commonwealth, we need to be sure that we're enforcing them properly to as far as they can go. My key interest in this debate over the last 6 years and prior to that has been on the mental health aspect. When you look at gun violence in the country, 2/3 of gun deaths in the country are suicides. And so I've spent my 6 years in the legislature working on mental health issues because I think that's where the biggest impact is going to be in this situation. We've been very proud of what we've been able to accomplish. There's a lot of work left to be done. But for me, looking at what we've done, we've added over almost $10 million to children's psychiatric care and crisis response, which I think is key in trying to allow that identification and intervention early on in the process for children. We've provided over $10 million in new money that wasn't in the budget, hasn't been in the budget since the 1990s for permanent supportive housing that provides long-term shelter and roof over somebody's head for the individuals with the most serious mental illness. We've added PAC teams, we've added assessment centers, and it's just, if you look at where we were and where we are headed and what we're doing now, I think it's been fantastic progress, and I look forward to continue carrying that banner into the future.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, where do you fall on the spectrum of gun laws? Should gun restrictions be lessened or removed? Should guns be banned altogether, or tougher restrictions needed when it comes to mental health and criminal background checks? Do you think that tougher enforcement of existing Virginia laws concerning firearms and harsher punishments for those who commit gun crimes is the best solution? Please begin.
Well, I am from this region. I grew up in Floyd, and I can tell you, I remember having a day where the majority of our school wasn't there because they were all taking advantage of their skip day to go hunting. You could still have excuse skip days for hunting. And there's one thing I don't agree with is removing the ability to have hunting or protect your property and protect your livestock. However, I don't believe that we hunt with semi-automatic rifles, and I don't think that is something we need to make available to people. Personally, I prefer to bow hunt, but sorry, that's the first thing I learned to shoot. I do believe that we need to have less available guns, and we need to be careful who has them, especially. I do believe in broader and strict background checks. I do not believe we need to have loopholes, such as doing festivals where people can come in to a private dealer. I believe that there needs to be checks across the board. You shouldn't be able to go on Craigslist and purchase a gun or trade a gun for any reason. guns are very dangerous, and we're not just talking about somebody actively trying to hurt someone. We're talking about even just freak accidents, like the woman who had one in her purse and it went off even though it wasn't loaded because there was something stuck in it and it triggered and it shot her leg, thankfully just her leg. Just the other day, a father was arrested because he handed his gun to his 2-year-old. People who have felonies they're not allowed to have guns, and quite honestly, we give them too much access. If they fight for their gun rights back, more than welcome to have one. However, if they are exposed to weapons when they're already a violent criminal, I think that we are not looking at the bigger picture, and we need to be paying attention to why they have access and what exactly are they having access to.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, where do you fall on the spectrum of gun laws? Should gun restrictions be lessened or removed? Should guns be banned altogether? Or tougher restrictions needed when it comes to mental health and criminal background checks? Do you think that tougher enforcement of existing Virginia laws concerning firearms and harsher punishments for those who commit gun crimes is the best solution? Please begin.
Yeah, I believe in individual rights. Those include the Second Amendment and gun owners' rights. I've been supported by the NRA and endorsed by them again this year. As my good friend Joseph Joe said, 2/3 of gun deaths in the country are due to suicide. The next largest group is young men shooting each other. This is a societal problem. We can do that with working with our mental health associations, our mental health hospitals and providers, and also working with our law enforcement. I'm a little bit older than everybody else up here, but back in the 90s, Richmond had a real big murder problem. And I don't know how best to say that. They were known for their murder rate. And the state came in and said, we're going to aggressively prosecute folks that use guns in a crime. And their murder rate's gone down. The availability of guns has gone up in the United States while our violent crime rate has gone down. So if we can have targeted help for folks who are suicidal, or these young men who may not have families, who may not have a support system, if we can offer those folks help through better schools, which the 10-10-10 plan really worked on. The second largest recipient of funds in that plan was Petersburg. This was a statewide plan. And if we can make sure that these folks have the support network that they need, prosecute real criminals. My opponent said something about felons getting their gun rights back. That is a separate way. You've got to go to the executive branch and the governor's office to get your civil rights restored if you're a felon, and then you have to go to a judge to get your gun rights restored. And so it's a much more difficult process. In that process, Commonwealth's attorneys and local law enforcement have to sign off on it. And so it's a much more difficult process.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hurst, where do you fall on the spectrum of gun laws? Should gun restrictions be lessened or removed? Should guns be banned altogether, or tougher restrictions needed when it comes to mental health and criminal background checks? Do you think that tougher enforcement of existing laws concerning firearms and harsher punishments for those who commit gun crimes is the best solution?
Well, coming from a journalism background, on the spectrum, I would definitely want to always be objective and journalistic in the way that I would approach any type of firearm legislation. So any bill that would come across my desk, if I were to be in Richmond, would need to have evidence-based behind it that would actually tangibly reduce the number of people who are dying from firearm-related deaths here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And more people die from firearm-related deaths now in the Commonwealth than from car crashes. So this is an issue that we need to address. But I'm a gun owner. I'm in a shotgun. I like to do skeet and trap. I believe in the Second Amendment. I shot my brother's AR-15. He built from a kit and hit clay pigeons from 100 yards away. I mean, it's like there's this myth out here that there are people who are identified as Democrats who don't like people who like guns, and that's certainly not me. Now, we do have some values, though, that I think we can all agree on. We don't want people who are beaten up on their intimate partners to be able to have a firearm if that person was courageous enough to go out and get a protective order out against them. I think we should expand possession prohibitions to people who are subject to emergency and temporary protective orders. I think that would save lives. I think we need to enforce laws that are on the books right now that would hold negligent firearm owners who allow children to die in accidental homicide or suicides because they didn't store their guns safely to be prosecuted. And a lot of times Commonwealth's attorneys just let those cases slide by. But we can't always pivot to this notion that it's just a mental health problem. You know, people with a mental illness are far more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator of one. You know, my mother has a diagnosable mental illness. I would never want anybody to think that she is somehow more violent than the general population. We need to be looking at people in crisis, and that means we need to be making more investments in threat assessment teams, not only in our schools and higher education institutions, but also in our workplaces too. And I want to also note that as we continue to look at more people who are approaching crisis and might have to have an inpatient psychiatric stay, I think our sheriff's candidates can talk a little bit more about this too, that we have created a huge burden on our law enforcement now, as we are transporting individuals all across the Commonwealth who have a mental illness for which they need to have an inpatient psychiatric stay.
Thank you very much. Continuing the theme of safety. And Ms. Kettner, this is your question to answer first. It's been said that Interstate 81 was never built to handle the amount of traffic it accommodates on a daily basis. A plan to widen it is on indefinite hold, and traffic accidents are a daily occurrence. Drivers who have not seen a recent electronic sign alerting them about an accident, and those who don't use Traffic Alert GPS have no advance warning when it comes to accidents that they may result in being stuck in traffic for hours. Suggestions that have been made include VDOT placing warning signs several miles ahead of the accident so drivers will have enough notice, or state police addressing the issue with enforcement. Are these feasible ideas? And then most importantly, what ideas do you have that could improve the I-81 experience? Please begin.
Yes. Well, actually, I am very aware of the 81 needing to be expanded, and I know that it costs over $1 million just to replace 1 mile, or even to repair 1 mile of 81. And I do believe that having more signs could be helpful, but at the same time they're a distraction, because if you're beside a tractor trailer truck, you're on the left side and he happens to block the sign, you didn't catch what it said. So if there is a large amount of traffic, especially during rush hour, you're not going to necessarily read the signs. So if they are going to have them, they're going to have to put in extra construction to put it overhead, like they do in some of the northern areas. Personally, I think one of the best solutions we could look at is having a broader range of public transportation. More buses. The VT has efficient, safe buses that can bus a lot of people around. We have the smart bus that goes from Christiansburg to Roanoke, but I don't think we have enough of that coming. Like here in Pulaski, you have multiple 81 exits, and you're not getting enough to take you from here to some of your bigger areas that you would be traveling on 81 for. And I think that I'm really excited. They're looking at bringing in the passenger rail to Roanoke and from Roanoke to Christiansburg. And I would like to see something similar expanded even further. Obviously, this isn't something we can make overnight, but I do want to see that we have more public transportation options. And they'll also say for people who don't have a lot of money that want a good job, they will be able to use public transportation to save their money up. And when you have a lot of areas like Floyd and Pulaski where not everyone can afford a car, therefore they have difficulty getting to a job, this will advance our ability to generate revenue and have our people employed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, what ideas do you have that could improve the Interstate 81 experience?
Yeah, well, first of all, let's start where we're at. 2 years ago, or was it 3 years ago, we passed what we call the SMART scale. It's a little wonky. I'm not going to bore you with the inside baseball, but what that did was allow 73.5% of all transportation monies to go to the districts in VDOT. Salem District, which is one we're in, actually has increased about $120 million through that SMART scale legislation that Joseph and I supported. That's been a big help. You see we're replacing the New River Bridge. It's actually about $10 million a mile to add a lane to the interstate system, and it's maybe a little more in the mountainous areas, which is where we live. So what I've been doing is working with VDOT on several ideas, which includes increased signage so folks know what's going on, but also pre-positioning tow trucks on heavy weekend traffic, so that the biggest backup is where you're trying to get those vehicles off. And Joseph and I supported legislation this year. It was actually illegal for tow trucks to drive down the side of the interstate, which is kind of silly because they need to get to the accident. So we supported legislation this year that allows tow trucks to use the sides, to use the medians in between to get to these accidents. we pre-position those, that's going to be a help. I know that the state police, I've also been in contact with them. They are also looking at their procedures on how we can speed up getting these accidents cleaned up. And but we're working on. We're also going to have to work on a solution for adding lanes for traffic. I think the original question was it was not designed to do what it's doing now. Trust me, I go back and forth to Richmond representing y'all a whole lot. I was down there. I drove down Sunday. It was one of the worst days to drive on Interstate 81 on Sunday.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Hurst, what are your ideas for improving the I-81 experience?
As a former reporter at WDBJ, I've been to my fair share of traffic accidents along 81 and talked to a lot of troopers. And my question is, you know, we all understand that this is an issue, and obviously prompting your question, so what can we do about it? And when I talk to troopers, they say, give us more resources so we can actually enforce the laws, you know, that we can actually pull over speeders, so that we don't have people who are traveling from one state to another through Virginia, who were sometimes going way over the speed limit and into reckless driving territory, still being able to basically get away with it because we don't support our men and women troopers to actually go out and enforce our traffic laws out on I-81. I think that's very important. We do need expansion of I-81. I think that, you know, making 3 lanes over Christiansburg Mountain is a good start. I think as the Roanoke Valley and the New River Valley continue to be more connected, we need to look at having 3 lanes on both sides of 81, and whether that's done by having a new transportation authority like Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads have, or whether it's by continuing the effort of having more local control and less central control. The VDOT dollars, I think, would also help as well. You know, I was knocking on doors in Fairlawn a few weeks ago, and a guy, it was a beautiful day, was riding up on a Harley and stopped and wanted to talk to me for a little while. And I said, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, I'm a trucker. And I said, well, it's kind of a departure for him to be on a Harley, but he's also a trucker. I said, well, you tell me, you drive on 81 all the time. What do you think needs to be done? He says, you know what? We need to support our truckers better. Because if I think the trucking industry were to step up its game and treat our truckers better, then they wouldn't be always rushing so much and passing all of these other trucks just to go a couple miles an hour faster than they are, slowing you all down, causing more accidents, just so that they can meet their quotas, just so that they can make sure they get to where they're going before they have to be taken off the road and are dealing with trying to make sure they get as much money per mile as they possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, what are your ideas to improve the I-81 experience?
Well, you know, as somebody who drives up and down Interstate 81, as Nick's well aware, when we go back and forth to Richmond, it's pretty unpredictable. I usually try to allot myself an extra hour beyond what it's supposed to take from getting my house to downtown, because invariably that hour is going to get swallowed up. Last year, I was trying to get down to the Hotel Roanoke for a dinner on a Friday night, left my house at 4, managed to get there just a little bit after 7 after sitting on Interstate 81 just past Toronto in an accident. You know, it is a problem. It's something that has steadily grown over the years, but I think back when we were first elected, it definitely has gotten worse since that time period. But I think, you know, as far as where we're going with some of the initiatives we've had in Richmond, in addition to the Smart Scale 2 years ago, in 2013, you know, we passed one of the first major investments in transportation in the Commonwealth, literally since 1986, the year that I was born. So in almost 27 years, you know, had not had a major investment into our transportation infrastructure. VDOT was telling us, you don't do something, there's no money for new construction, there's barely enough money to have to maintain what we've got, you've got to do something. So we came together and passed this bipartisan compromise. We've seen a lot of come out of that compromise over the last 4 years, and with new construction, including the bridge construction, a lot of paving going on 460 through Montgomery County and Pulaski and Giles and 100. But I think one of the big things that we have worked on over the last several years is passenger rail. It's going to start in Roanoke on Halloween of this year on October 31st. I've been involved with the group since October of 2013 to try to push that issue forward, because I think that's going to be a big deal for us. Not only to help try to lessen our transportation woes on 81, but it's going to be a huge economic development driver for this region. If you can get on an Amtrak train and be able to be in New York by late afternoon, by Boston in the early evening, you're going to open us up to a whole range of possibilities and new ideas and innovation coming to this area because of that link.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got time for one last question before we go to our closing statements, and this is dealing with social issues. Mr. Rush will have the opportunity to answer this question first. Historical monuments have become a hot-button issue in Virginia and across the nation here in 2017. How do you think the state should or should not address the placement or removal of these monuments? So just ask that again. How should the state or should it not address the placement or removal of historical monuments? Please begin.
Well, I think the current law is that you cannot remove historical monuments, and I support that law. I believe we need to remove historical monuments. And I think I was reading today online, and I hope it's in the Trump monument. I hope it wasn't from like 5 years ago. That was a joke, come on. But I was reading today that a federal court judge also called for the removal of a World War I monument that was almost 100 years old because it was in the form of a cross. So my question is, where does this end? So I'm going to stay strong, and I'm not going to support a law that changes and allows historical monuments to be taken down.
Please, folks, I will ask you to stop right there. I appreciate the sentiment, but we're not doing that. Thank you very much. Mr. Hurst, how do you think the state should or should not address the placement or removal of these monuments?
I think the state should not unilaterally make any decision-making when it comes to all of the monuments that are in our Commonwealth. I think that it should be up to local control, and each monument should be looked at in its local context. You know, I do think we need to evaluate that some monuments were erected that might have been done in order to subvert a minority population. If that's the case, and the locality decides that then it's time to address that, then they should be allowed to do so for local control. But you know, like in Blacksburg, there is a cemetery where there are Confederate soldiers buried, and there's a Confederate display marker signifying that. I don't think we should be messing with that. I really think that what we really need to be focusing on is how are our minority populations being disenfranchised and discriminated against right now, which is certainly happening in our criminal justice system, certainly happening in our education system, happening in our ability for our men and women of color, not only here in Pulaski County, but all across the Commonwealth, to be able to achieve upward mobility. I think the Confederate statue issue has become very divisive and is the worst kind of politics that has kind of blighted our day, that continues to separate us and move us more into different tribes rather than trying to unite us and find common solutions. But let me be very clear. I have no interest in taking down any monument that is there for historical significance, no matter if it's in Pulaski County, or if it's in Giles County, or if it's in Montgomery County.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, how do you think the state should or should not address the placement or removal of historical monuments?
I think if anything, we need to be talking about our history and teaching it every day, not trying to erase it. If you look at, what is going on, if you don't take them down. It's that simple. Don't take them down. Add historical context to it. Tell the whole story of what we're trying to tell with whatever monument we're talking about, whether it's World War I, whether it's the Civil War. And I agree with Nick. I mean, where does it stop? Because there's certain things that everybody finds offensive. My concern would be, today we're talking about monuments to the Civil War. Next we're going to be talking about Monticello. Next we're going to be talking about Mount Vernon, James Madison. Especially, where does it stop after this? I think we need to be teaching our history in a way that provides context for everybody about that period, whether we're talking about any historical period, but leave them up.
Thank you very much. Ms. Kettner, how do you think the state should or should not address the removal or placement of historical monuments?
Personally, I also do not believe it is a statewide issue. The law is in place. I do believe if we were going to alter it, we do need to leave it to the locale to make the decision. You're going to have some areas where just the general populace says it's not for us, and it's not necessarily going to be we hate it or we're offended by it. It could just be we're ready to move to something more pinnacle to our modern day society. And we have that history over the long term. You have artifacts that have been moved from their original locations and moved to safe housing, whether it be in a cemetery with the people that it represented, or whether it is in a private collection or in a museum. And we're going back hundreds of years that we're finding this. However, I don't believe that what we need to be doing is just ripping them down and destroying them. Though not all may survive, that is due to the manufacturer that it was in the time. But when you look even in the house There is this beautiful, there in the Capitol, there's this beautiful monument statue of George Washington, and it has been moved from its original location, and part of that was for preservation purposes. One thing I absolutely do not agree with is individuals going in and ripping them down themselves or ruining them. I do believe that needs to remain being illegal. I do not support violence. I do agree with Mr. Hurst over here that something that is important is addressing the behavior towards our fellow man and the representation that the local community is giving to a monument, because though we may have it up for one reason, other people may be ascribing a different meaning and a different response to it. But I do not believe that we have to keep them. However, I believe it does belong to the people in the area to make the decision.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, hold tight. We're not going to do that quite yet. You'll have an opportunity to applaud just here in a few minutes. We've gotten through the question and answer portion of our program this evening. Great job. Thank you very much. We're going to give each of you an opportunity to make a closing statement. You have 2 minutes to wrap things up, and we'll begin with Mr. Hurst.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here in attendance. I think this is great. This is democracy in action. You guys want to kick the tires on us. You want to hear from us directly, and certainly we'll be available after this, too, and after the sheriff's portion to answer any questions personally. Yeah, I chose to leave a good job, a career I loved, a career that I was very passionate about, that many of you might have seen me on the news at 6 and 11 o'clock for many, many years. And I went through a change in my life where I knew that I needed to find a plan B. And what I knew I didn't want to do was leave Southwest Virginia, even though I'm not from here. This is where I choose to live, and this is where I choose to put down my roots, you know. My great-grandmother lived in Oklahoma and was the first woman in the state of Oklahoma to have a driver's license. She moved with my grandmother to Tampa to escape the Dust Bowl because she was having to sell piano lessons for chickens. And then my parents moved from Florida to Pennsylvania so my father could pursue his dream of combining his love of photography and being a mechanic into automotive advertising. So all I want to do is continue that pioneering spirit of Southwest Virginia and staking my claim. And my claim is here in Southwest Virginia because I'm galvanized with the people who have given me so much love and prayer and thought and support during my time of need. And this, I think, is a way for me to give back in a more direct way. I think we need loud, strong voices for the New River Valley and for Southwest Virginia, because it doesn't matter where you're from, it matters where we're going. And right now, it seems like too many people are stuck. And I want to help be someone who is going to be someone who shakes up the status quo and makes sure that we actually do bring fundamental progress here to Pulaski County and the rest of the New River Valley. And I hope that I can earn your vote and be that loud, strong voice representing you in the General Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Yost, your closing statement.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the Southwest Times and everyone involved again in putting on a great candidate forum for everybody to get out and listen to the issues. You know, I was born and raised here in Southwest Virginia. Grew up in Giles County, graduated from Giles High School, went to Radford University, lived in Fairlawn for a short period of time while going to school there, lived in Blacksburg for a while, and now live back in Giles in Harrisburg with my wife Lisa and our 16-month-old daughter Virginia. And for me, it's all about her, my 16-month-old, representing my home and the oldest continuously meeting legislative body in the Western Hemisphere over the last 6 years. It's been one of the highest honors in my life, but I want to be able to give her the same experience that I had growing up in this area. And that was excellent public schools, unlimited opportunities at our higher education institutions like Tech and Radford and New River Community College, and a natural environment that is beautiful and pristine, and just that's all you want to do is spend time outside. And for me, that's what it's all about. We've done a lot of great things over the last 6 years in the areas of education and mental health, transportation, and then we've served 80,000 plus constituents over the last 6 years as well on issues ranging from DMV to BDOT and stuff like that. And it has been my true honor, and that's why I'm doing it again, and that's why I hope to have your support on November 7th.
Thank you, Mr. Yost. Ms. Ketton.
Yes, I grew up in this area. I grew up in Floyd, graduated from there, moved on to Radford University, and again graduated from there. When I graduated, I followed my now husband out of the area, and every year I kept saying, when are we going back? When are we going back? And when my third child was on the way, we came back. My children are 3, 5, and 6. And I wanted them to have the opportunities that I had to become who I wanted. I wanted them to have the woods, the trees to climb in, and trust me, they're in them all the time. I wanted them to have the community that I was a part of. You didn't drive through these areas without waving back and forth with each other and smiling, and I wanted to bring that to them. So I brought them here, and it was wonderful. It was the best thing I could have possibly done, because I just didn't want to leave my mountains. I was raised in the area by my grandmother, who had trouble getting around. I worked really hard at everything I could possibly do, and every job I've ever had, and I've held a job until I had my children and stayed home with them. And I am a member of the community. I go to the same events. I'm social. I talk to people in the parking lot, in the grocery store, everywhere I go. I enjoy being in a community just like this. This is what I wanted for my children. But what I want most is to make sure that when we go to bed at night, all of us, I want to make sure that we can sleep soundly and know that in the morning, everything is going to be fine. For us, for our children, for our neighbors, for our schools, for our jobs. I want to make sure that we have what we wanted, the classic Main Street that we could walk down and enjoy. And I want to preserve that, and I want to resurrect what we had and mix it with what we have to offer.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rush, your closing statement.
Thank you for hosting it or moderating this, and thank the Southwest Times for holding the event, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Ms. Kettner. She's been a wonderful opponent this session. She's ran on ideals, and I think you see the differences that we've expressed tonight. I am a native of the New River Valley. I was born and raised here. I graduated Christiansburg High School. I joined the U.S. Army at graduation, became a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division. I came back and was lucky enough to get a job as a FedEx driver. And I've delivered just about every place you can imagine in Pulaski County. I usually say if there's a road in Pulaski that I haven't been on, it's because they just built it. I know the difference between Hiawassee and Allisonia. That's a thing. There's Max Creek in between. And this is very, very important to me. When I was going, I got a different university experience than most. I drove a FedEx truck during the day, and then drove a 1979 Chevy Malibu to Dublin every night, well, 4 nights a week, to go to night school at New River Community College. And it's that kind of experience has formed me. I alluded to it, or I didn't allude to it, I told you. I'm a U.S. Army vet. I'm very mission-oriented. For the last 26 years, we've had accomplishments in my public service, whether it be new schools, whether it be able to appropriate more money to Pulaski County schools. And I'm very mission-oriented. And I wake up every morning with one mission on my mind, and that's to make the New River Valley the best place to live, work, raise a family, and retire. And yeah, I'd like to return to Richmond, and I ask for your vote on November 7th.
Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for our And thank you to our audience. You did really well except for one little area, but that's okay. Got it out of your system. We're going to take a brief intermission, and then we're going to come back with our candidates for sheriff. So thank you all very much. Please take a moment to stretch.